And we're live with our 225th episode of Absolute AppSec. I'm Ken Johnson at CK Tricky on X, joined by my co-host Seth Law at Seth Law on X. Seth, say hi.
Hi, everyone. Welcome back to another episode. We are excited, as always, to be here, to be talking, to catch back up. We're very excited to have Brian with us today from NowSecure. We'll get into introductions shortly with him and his background, which sounds super interesting. We were already talking about it on the pre-show a little bit. As far as announcements go, I really don't have a lot outside of join us on Slack, ping us there, watch for announcements on upcoming training courses. We've got a couple of conferences that we're targeting for the Practical Secure Code Review. And we have AI updates. Ken and I have been talking quite a bit as far as how to utilize AI in code reviews, right? And the different approaches that can be used to help speed up our process, the manual process that we do on a daily basis. Outside of that, Ken, I mean, is there anything else that you wanted to bring up? Any places that you're going to be? My travel has slowed down just because it is Q4. And yeah, that's kind of hellacious timing for me on the consulting side. So anything from you?
I talked to the organizers of CactusCon yesterday, or one of them, and so that's going to happen February 16th and 17th. So mark that on your calendar if y'all want to go to CactusCon. I'm going to be for sure making my way out there. May even look to do some sponsoring or something like that. So I'm stoked. But yeah, besides that, no travel. No travel is good good times. Like 2 months of no travel at least.
Sweet. Good call. All right. Then, yeah, with that, we would like to introduce Brian Reed from NowSecure. Brian has an interesting mobile background, and we're going to dive into it. I know it's been a while on the podcast since we talked about mobile security testing, and he's been instrumental or part of the mobile MASVS project at OWASP. But before we get into that, I know he was involved early on, like his resume, with Blackberry. So, Brian, if you want to just give a short introduction and tell us what you did at Blackberry, kind of how you got into the security space. Let's just start there and kick things off.
So thanks for having me, guys. Fan of the podcast. Have my own DSO bunch monthly live stream as well. So it's great to be able to share with the community. So I am an old mobile tech guy. You can tell by all my gray hair. I've been around for a little while. Way back when, in the 1990s, I got involved with Microsoft and a small airplane company called Boeing to try to create one of the first mobile apps that ever existed. And that early touch of mobile in the late 90s led me to getting involved as a partner with RIM on the pager side to produce the first app that ran on a pager. So just think about that. Went off and did other stuff, kind of mobile disappeared. Boom, around 94, 95, got involved with another mobile company. It was a partner of Blackberry. And at that point, the smartphone existed. Mm-hmm. And so in working with that partner, I eventually became part of Blackberry as it went through its ascendant world. And back then, the debate was whether Microsoft, Nokia, or Blackberry was going to win the mobile race. And everyone had modeled that mobile's penetration in the world for smartphones would maybe be 20% of the humans in the world would have a Blackberry, Nokia, or Microsoft Windows CE device. Uh-huh. Then this guy, Steve Jobs, happened. So in that journey, it was really great to be a part of Blackberry and growing in secure email and secure messaging and the interconnected community and world and all those. It was just really sort of an exciting time to really grow around. But then the iPhone kind of came out of nowhere. I wound up with another company, and that company partnered with Good Technology. Good Technology was a way to turn an iPad or an Android device security to meet the FIPS requirements like BlackBerry. And so our early customers were like government and banks who wanted to bring iPads and iPhones in and have BlackBerry grade security. Well, fast forward about 2 years into that, and BlackBerry buys Good Technology. So I'm back at BlackBerry again.
BlackBerry.
So worked on the transition and integration into that. And today, BlackBerry doesn't make devices anymore. BlackBerry is a more general security company, has some specialized IoT technology, and the old stuff I work with at Boxtone and Good Technology are still part of the BlackBerry portfolio. But as you've seen, they bought a bunch of other companies. Very much going to change their world. So I cannot confirm or deny the movie on BlackBerry, but I am doing mobile for the better part of 25 years and something mobile security related for the better part of like 16 or 18 years. I landed at NowSecure. NowSecure is a partner of Good Technology and was doing forensic pen testing for the secure container that Good Technology was creating.
Mm-hmm.
And NowSecure did a bunch of testing in the early days of Samsung Knox, which is a way to make a Samsung device super secure, like the kind of Good Technology or BlackBerry stuff. And Samsung was taking a run at the enterprise and government world with a partitioned device that had a secure enclave on it. Okay. So I joined NowSecure, and I've now been here for 5 or 6 years, and I serve in driving strategy. I'm an evangelist. I work with OWASP on the MASVS. I do a lot of talks. I drive a lot of our strategy in the market and a lot of the innovations we've done over the years. And that kind of brings me here today. So that's a little bit of my crazy origin story.
Yeah, that's good. I mean, I have lots of questions, right? It's more kind of related on to like, the path. Everybody's path into security always seems to be a little bit of a winding, right? Like winding road. What is it, where did you start, like from an educational perspective to get into like the pager and the that community at large, right? Like so way back in the day.
I get it. So I was one of the first peoples to work on software around Windows. Okay. And was involved in this thing that was this weird Windows development environment called Visual Basic. Which then became Visual Studio and a bunch of other things there. So I had a lot of application development, which is how I got involved in like the early days of Windows devices, building apps and some things like that. Now, the company I worked for, I was a partner of Microsoft. The company I worked for worked with all the large banks and telcos, and a lot of industrial companies. And that's how I got involved, like in the Boeing industrial project. We did a mobile project with Home Depot when they were getting started, and so on and so forth. So that first taste of mobile was, if you think of that world as sort of Nokia, Microsoft Windows, late 90s-ish thing. Now, one of the banks we were working with wanted to be able to do something on a pager. And so I was part of this little innovation group in my company, and that's how I got the pager. Security was never anything for me until I partnered with BlackBerry. And what we were helping BlackBerry do was really what today we would call resiliency. So we were bringing high availability, high reliability, application performance management style capabilities to the BlackBerry world, because I'd come from development and scalable systems. And so my company was helping BlackBerry grow high volume, high scale, massively distributed customers who had 200,000 BlackBerries and wanted it to run on 5 nines. Yeah. I bled into the security side from the performance side. Okay. And so as part of working with them, I learned about the BlackBerry architecture and the secure enclave and et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, what made it a better world. And then the application level security happened actually when I joined Good Technology, because we were trying to make mobile apps secure for iOS and Android to mimic what was going on a BlackBerry device. And so my learning is very adjacent. I didn't aim to become a security guy. I kind of fell into it through mobile, doing mobile performance and scalability, and then kind of crawled my way into mobile applications.
Okay.
In the mobile
world. Yeah, it makes sense, right? Like from the BlackBerry movie kind of goes into the whole availability, like the ability to, support so many devices in a world where that just wasn't the case in the past, right? And so, falling into it from that angle, I mean, it feels natural, right? I'm sure that's just, how it goes. Sweet. Yeah. I mean, any other comments on the movie specifically outside of, like
all movies, if you talk to people who are related to what was the Facebook movie, is like, how the social network movie, how accurate really was that. There's a lot. I mean, I didn't live all this stuff in the BlackBerry movie, so I can't attest to it, but some of the twists and turns that happened in the market, I very much lived through. And so the thing that blew me away was when I was having meetings with Wall Street banks and asking them what features they wanted next. And they're telling me the feature I want is BlackBerry security on an iPad. And that's when I knew something was up. Right. So for me, a lot of it was a really great ride with BlackBerry. And then this really unusual disjointed shift in the market that suddenly became everybody's got a tablet, everybody's got a phone, everybody wants connectivity. Right.
Yeah.
That was pretty wild because I always saw them as having a great defensive moat. And, they were clearly the best of breed. Right. In terms of what they did with secure messaging and some of the early app services that were on it and so on and so forth. So, the movie's interesting. There's been some books written about it too. And, probably somewhere someone could do a Harvard Business School study on myopathy and ignoring what's going on in the market around you while the market changes.
Yeah.
Which is really, I think, what happened there.
Wasn't that the advantage? Now that you're mentioning BlackBerry's security, wasn't that their initial advantage was something along the lines of like enterprises could securely manage those devices?
Oh, absolutely. I mean, BlackBerry had every
Apple
security thing on the planet. They had every cert. They were FIPS certified. They met every government regulatory stuff. If they went into a country like Germany and Germany said, by the way, I need you to get this other cert or support this other secure capability for government use, they would do it. Not spying on people, more like, locking it down. So it's really incredibly well locked down environment. What basically happened, I would articulate from a mobile perspective, is people just like the iPhone and Android experience better. And they were commoditized into the marketplace. And so what wound up happening was you have this QWERTY keyboard thing from BlackBerry. As soon as it tried to be a touchscreen device, that got really funky. But my iPhone and my iPad are killer touchscreen devices and have all these apps. And BlackBerry had a very limited app ecosystem. So to me, a lot of it is the apps and the app experience on the iPhone and the Android is what beat BlackBerry. And what was shocking to me was in seeing these high secure scenarios where they were just breaking the rules and CISOs were like writing off and granting exceptions. Like, yeah, we have these high security requirements, but I'm going to grant an exception to the CEO to use an iPad with company data. Yeah. So the whole ease of use of iPhone and Android literally clobbered the CISO on the security side and beat them into submission. Now, part of the reason I joined Good Technology, I was like, oh, this is really cool. iPhone and Android's growing like a rocket. They have security. They make an iPhone and Android device as secure as a BlackBerry. This ought to go like gangbusters. And it did for a while. And then people just started saying, you know what? I really don't care that much about mobile security like I thought I did before. And so while there's industrial strength BlackBerry devices, hardware, software solution, and there's high security, good technology, containerized secure solution, the default stuff on an iPhone is good enough for most business scenarios. And so boom, right? Apple and Android didn't focus a lot on building security to meet BlackBerry. They didn't try to fight that fight. They tried to make the best consumer-driven devices that could be used at work. Yeah. Right. And so
it's interesting how well that worked.
It did. If you look at a lot of things today, the consumerization of what we can traditionally think of as technology is driving so many things, right? People prefer the easy to use. They prefer the easy to buy versus the industrial strength capabilities for many things, unless they're in some unique market where they need to have it.
Oh, that's an interesting comment by Leisure Suit Larry, which is Cydia and jailbreaking from users wanting more than what the device providers gave everyone and drove the App Store creation, and then every device manufacturer ended up having some sort of correction around that. Yeah, I do remember when there were so many limitations, and I mean, I think, yeah, which I'm sure we're going to get into, but I look back at those early days of testing and just messing with phones and like iPhones specifically.
Wild West. Yeah,
it was the Wild West.
It was absolutely the Wild West. I mean, and we were working really hard, like at Good, to lock down, create a containerized session. And so how do we do that? Well, we had to jailbreak the devices and then test the software on it. It was easy to root an Android device. And we had our own testing teams. We had outside pen testing companies and forensics companies that were banging on us and so on and so forth. And fast forward to today, Apple's been fighting the jailbreak for a really long time. And it's really hard now to jailbreak a device reliably and keep it jailbroken, right? So if you're a mobile pen tester today, your life is really tough in terms of just managing that that testing environment. I think that's one of the reasons, like Corellium, if you're familiar with Corellium, they're virtualized devices, hardware-based virtualized devices. They're big in the research community and the advanced pen testing community because it gets over that hurdle of the pen test and allows people to focus on the actual work they're trying to do in testing an environment. But we want safe and secure. Like, no one was jailbreaking a BlackBerry device to see if it was safe. Like, there's this whole interesting thing about the BlackBerry ecosystem had built up so much trust and so many certifications that the whole notion of like jailbreaking and testing didn't exist the way developed in the app ecosystem for iPhone and Android. Completely discontiguous model. People trusted what BlackBerry was doing. They had all these different kinds of certifications and independent third-party certs that they just trusted that environment. When Apple and Google weren't security is the most important thing, the way BlackBerry, it was more consumer ease of use, app store access, things like that. Then people became concerned about testing it over time, like many other things. And you're often running with customizations like the jailbreaks and the various things that have evolved in the land of security and privacy that we know today.
Yeah. Well, I mean, that kind of brings us to MASVS, right? Like, we were jailbreaking like the rooted devices on the Android side. I mean, the early versions of iOS didn't even have the concept of apps, right? Like, I remember it just being like the web, the web pages that you could pin to the machine. Yeah. And it was just a phone, and it got pushed that direction, to Ken's point. But I know you guys just released that like version 2.0.0 of MASVS. Like, how does that tie into the testing framework and like what penetration testers could use or assessment?
It's good. So I'm going to take you on a little journey of mobile, right? So if you go all the way back to 2013, the OWASP top 10 and the ASVS were well mature. And around about 2013, a group of folks got together and said, you know what? Mobile is different enough that, like, if I try to use the ASVS, there's stuff that fits and stuff that doesn't, because the architecture of mobile is different and the capabilities of mobile is different. And there's also stuff the ASVS is missing, right? And so the original OWASP Mobile Top 10 came out in 2014, and that kind of evolved through a few revisions. Then an MASVS was created. And then, version 1 came out, 1.x.x, and we went through some revisions. And now MASVS v2.0.0 came out earlier this year, and we're about to finish MASTG to go with it, version 2. Number of things that we've learned along the way, right? So at some point, maybe I'll detour into the differences between web and mobile, but I'll talk about kind of what we've learned more recently with the MASVS. And the original MASVS version 1 kind of assumed it needed to be its own doc. So inside of it, there were also API security testing characteristics. Inside of the doc, there were also things that really should live in the ASVS and not be part of MASVS, right? Like, this is the mobile part. If you need to test the other parts, go to the ASVS or the API security top 10 or something like that. So one chunk of this was removing things like architecture and any of the tests or controls that were related. They're really covered better in the ASVS rather than trying to keep them in sync, which became a problem, right? Second thing was recognizing that we had a lot of MASVS controls and a lot of tests, and it had commingled tests with controls and categories. So we've moved a number of the controls and categories to test because they really belong there. So what you have today with MASVS 2.0 is you have 7, not 8 controls because architecture is pulled out. They're all smaller and more focused on very specific areas, right? So again, there's some differences with web, but you have storage, you have crypto, you have auth, you have network, you have platform, code, and resilience. And so within each of those, there may be just a small handful of MASVS requirements now that are specified in each one because we've really honed in on what really matters. We've also recognized the similarities and differences with iOS and Android, right? Because there are some variations between the two. The other thing that's advanced substantially is this notion of resilience, and I'll go off into mobile for a second. If you think about a web app today, there's a lot of defense infrastructure built into a web app because its storage and a lot of its logic are behind firewall and layers of security, whether that's in the cloud or in your data center or both. So the exposed attack surface of a web app is predominantly the APIs from the back end, and then whatever code is downloading in your browser. Mobile all your IP is on the device. All your IP is on the device. So we were talking about jailbreak earlier. If I jailbreak or root my iOS or Android device, I can see that code. I can tear that code apart. Apple's got some DRM that kind of makes it a little slower, but I can still get there eventually. And there's really great tools like ones we create that are called Frida and Radari that are good reversing tools. They're used for non-mobile as well, and so on and so forth. So one of the important things that we've evolved heavily is this notion of resilience, which is basically anti-tampering. Apple and Google have some anti-tampering features and APIs in their development environments, but we strongly recommend using third-party anti-tampering as well. Why? Because your code is in the wild. When I first joined NowSecure, one of the things I heard that I had never heard before was from a senior executive at a bank in Canada. And he was telling me what terrifies us is how much code is in the wild on those iPhone and Android devices, right? And in the first couple of weeks I was here, we did some pen tests along with our automated testing. Some of those pen tests were mind-blowing. Like we had one customer who came and said, for some reason, we keep finding fake coupons on the dark web, and we can't figure out why. So we opened their app up. First thing is we could get to the code. Like there was no anti-tampering in the app. The second thing was they were generating unique coupon codes in the IP on the device, not on the back end.
Yeah.
So of course, the algorithm was on the dark web, and everybody's generating their free coupons, right? Yeah. And so, it's just an example where in mobile architecture matters, testing strategy matters, right? And application design, also matter in it. So the evolution now is it's a more mature standard. We've got a really strong working team, group of different people in the industry who've all been involved for a number of years. They're all active pen testers. They're all active training people. They're also working on commercial software, working with commercial companies. I'm not sure how many of those are public, so I'm not going to go down the path of all of them because some of them are using their personal time on it. But it's really, the MASVS is really matured now. And it's now, like things we just announced, it's now adding privacy. Mm-hmm. So we have a new control in beta that's the 8th control that's around privacy and looking at privacy mandates and privacy requirements, right? So we know that a vulnerability could violate a privacy issue, but we also know there are privacy things that have nothing to do with the vulnerability. Does my app access the address book and can it scrape the contact database? That's a privacy issue. That's not a vulnerability because it's built for that feature, right? That could be a design paradigm thing. So, one of the big things we're working on now is bringing it into privacy. The second thing we're working on is automation. Anyone who's ever used the ASVS knows you can't push a button and automatically generate a test run with ASVS. Yeah. We're trying to get there with MASVS. Okay. And so you'll see more and more automatable tests coming through over the next year because we'd like to get as close as we can as an industry to point and click automation. Can I plug this thing in my pipeline, let my developers run wild while they're coding? When they check in their code, run a test because you got to test the binary, not the source, to get accurate behavior, and run that and actually have it complete all of the MASVS tests and the entire MASTG book of tests and give you a red light, green light at the end. That's the dream. And we may be within a year and a half of getting to that, because then that would support the fast development cycles, allow people to just create their release requirements of I care about this, I don't care about that, and let it run. We want to do it for privacy, we want to do it for security. So it's been a really interesting journey. So
yeah.
I wanted to dig into a bit though, because you all have so much experience. I do not have. I think the last time I messed around with mobile it's a little hazy, but I want to say between maybe 2014, 2015, something like that. But anyways, that's kind of where it's dropped off for me. Back then, it was pretty simple. It was a lot of people storing things in plain text in files, like you said, making both for Android and for iPhone, making these apps that do things that are super sensitive, but you can get the code so you can see those sensitive operations and reverse them. Those were kind of like some of the most common things, I think. But I don't know these days, what are yes, I could look at the mobile top 10, sure, but is that really representative? I'm more curious about sort of what you all here experience, having so much time on this. What are the common bits that you see the most?
I'll give you two slices of the common bits, and clearly anyone who's lived in this space will see should be living. If you're out there doing mobile pen testing, what I'm about to say should look like the world that you're seeing. So the first one I'll do is I'll actually work from a benchmark we just released. So we've got this thing called the Mobile Risk Tracker, and it monitors the top 6,000 apps in the Apple App Store and the Google Play Store by popularity, not including things like games, because like games don't really matter. So like hospitality, travel, transportation, healthcare, finance, those kinds of industries are all in there. So we decided to go take a slice of that data and say, let's run the MASVS checks against those 6,000 apps and see what we can find, right? And what we found is what we see in our pen testing and our larger scale customer testing. So the number one vulnerability area is network. There still is a high degree of failure for developers to use properly secure network connections. Ideally, they should be doing cert pinning. Cert pinning is not easy. There's a lot of use of third-party libraries. More than half of the network data leakage happens with a third-party library, not necessarily first-party code the developer wrote. Now, over the years, Apple and Google have tried to improve that by creating ATS and NSC, but the number of developers that deactivate them by default at load time and then roll into their own code is shocking, which is why the number one vulnerability we find and have for years is network. Mm-hmm. You can ask a question.
So they did make it easier, it sounds like, but then developers are undoing what
disabling
makes it easier to do.
They're disabling it. Yeah. So we actually have a check. We have a static check looking for is ATS enabled or disabled, and is NSC, network security control, enabled or disabled at load time, and we can find that. Boom. Now, that can be a whole lot of reasons. Remember, there's 6 million apps in the App Store, but 5 million of them have existed for years. And so some of this is just they wrote the app before the new APIs were created, and they haven't gone back and updated the app, right? So you do have the history thing, right? And ATS was in iOS 7 or 8. To give you an example, NSC was Android 8 or 9. So there's some history to that. Now, it would be nuts to write a new app today and not use them. And I haven't looked at the data from App Age to see what that looks like. Our pen testing team might be able to see it. Now, the second category is actually platform. So platform is how the app interacts with the operating system. So do you hide text from memory when the app goes in the background? Something kind of unique to mobile that's easy for a developer to make a mistake on. Are you doing permissions correctly on Android is another place where developers might be saying, well, I'll just open up all the permissions, but that ultimately creates exposure for the user, things like that. And then I glue these together, storage and crypto. So there's local storage. Am I storing too much? Am I storing anything at all? Am I storing it in clear text? Is it properly encrypted or not? And then there's just crypto for crypto's sake of doing crypto the right way. And we all know developers, even security people, crypto is a black box that people don't always understand and don't always do the right way, right? Yeah, now I'm going to give you another slice of data. So we've been doing a lot of talks to the Android developer community, and part of that's because we're working with Google on something called ADA validation. So on Android, Google has a third-party security verification program called ADA MASA. Now, ADA MASA is just OWASP under the hood. They literally picked up OWASP, took a chunk of the MASVS, and said, this is going to be our certification regime. And then there's six validation or certification vendors that can certify an Android app meets the security bar. In the training we've been doing, and I just did another one of these a couple of weeks ago at a DroidCon, the number one issue we find on Android is crypto. It's the number one issue. Number two issue on Android is storage, and it's all the same thing. What's also interesting about the Android specific data is most of the ADA MASA failures we find are third-party code, not first-party code, meaning developers are doing a pretty good job of writing secure code on Android. The libraries they're choosing are often pretty yucky. And so you wind up, leaking data here or sending data to an improper address. The data may not be encrypted well with the third-party library that's sending some of your data off to another resource for processing, things like that. So one of the things Google's doing, by the way, and for those of you working in the Android ecosystem, Google's now publishing the SDK index. So Google is making a vehicle they call the SDK index, which is a place to go see what Android libraries they consider better to use. Notice I didn't use the word safe and certified yet. Maybe that'll happen someday, but these are preferred libraries that are recommended by the Android team that are better to use when you're building an Android app. A lot of this is because all this data we've gathered around these ADA validations about where developer issues are or are not, and how a number of them are actually tied to third-party libraries, right? So the ones in that index are generally really good.
Mm-hmm. I mean, it's interesting how much, well, it's interesting how similar the ecosystems are. So building an app for Android, for iOS, for the web, but then how the threats differ, right? Like I really I got distracted a little bit actually browsing through the new MASVS, right? Because it is so succinct as far as like the different verification, the different topics that you've got included in there, and it isn't too prescriptive, right? Like it's definitely very much, hey, this is what we're concerned about. Like it feels more threat focused, as it should be, as opposed to like the testing guide and very specific platform vulnerabilities. And then it also bleeds into this idea of the software or the software supply chain, right? What SDKs, what third-party libraries are you using to build your software? Are you building something that is safe? And like we've known that this is an issue. We've speculated about it for years, and it's coming to a head in both mobile and in
web
and APIs everywhere. Like right now, it's having a moment because it is so dangerous, and that's where we see those vulnerabilities pop up.
Yeah, it's interesting. So the Google SDK index has been a very interesting path towards kind of helping people, better understand what's out there. Clearly, SCA, software supply chain overall, is an issue. What's also interesting is the preeminent SCA vendors that you might think of don't have a lot of third-party code that's mobile specific in their repos. So when you go into some of the more popular vendors' repos, you'll see miles and miles and miles of web. If you print it all out, miles and miles of web and web history, but there's just not a lot of data on the SDKs. We're starting to build out a data set ourselves now that we're seeing that the first-party code is getting better and the third-party code is getting worse. We're like, okay, well, let's try to better model those things. So, for example, a couple of weeks ago, we just announced SDK pen testing. So some of those vendors in the index are now getting SDK pen testing with a validation that goes with it that says this thing is doing crypto and storage and network, et cetera, correctly. It's using the OWASP MASVS, but a slice of it that's SDK oriented. But if you think about it, an SDK could do just about anything an app could do in theory. So you can use the MASVS as a test vehicle. And that's been interesting because that gives that will give attestation to other people using their SDKs that says, yeah, this has been tested and it meets the OWASP MASVS standards, so it should be safe to use in your app. We think that's an interesting way to kind of help the market get to it. And over time, we may wind up building out more of a database of these third-party libraries. Our commercial software has a few dozen third-party libraries that are vulnerable in it. You may remember there was like the Russian malware that was PushWush a few years ago what was the one that just popped? Oh, there's another APK masking piece of malware that goes in and manipulates the APK at load time that then turns into malicious behavior. I can't remember the name of it right now. So, there's people, bad guys are messing around with SDKs for mobile just the same way they're doing it in the web world.
Yeah. Because that was kind of my question too, is like, we've had all these last few, like maybe 5 years, there's been all this like package manager related attacks, right? All these third-party attacks and, folks trying to inject malicious stuff into the web tech stack, basically. Like, is that as prevalent in the mobile world, or it's prevalent but affecting it differently? Or
yeah, it's there. The PushWush is a good example where PushWush is a push notification SDK that third-party developers can use. This third-party SDK they can license that allows you to just very simply do push notifications on any device, any platform, any way, using any relay or router. Right? Makes sense. Well, somewhere around the time of the Ukraine war start with Russia, that thing turned into data harvesting malware. So the versions changed, and boom, we had data harvesting malware. So basically they did a version update and its behavior changed. Now, this was found by a researcher. The scary part, so the researcher came to us in the US, is a researcher related to the US government, came to us and said, oh my God, how many apps have this? Well, we ran our database of millions of apps in the App Store. We found about 8,000 apps in the first 24 hours that were like CDC, US Army, Unilever, like big name companies that were using this. And what had happened is this app had basically a mailing address. The company had a mailing address in the US, but it was a Russian front, right? Mm. So that's an example of that classic sort of popular, effective, good SDK that went bad. Yeah. Now, it turns out the owner of the IP was inherently bad and was just leaving it laying in wait till there was a time to use it. And then there's other people that are, intentionally doing bad SDKs out there, right? Kind of, what do you call it? Like a sleeper agent. It was a sleeper SDK that kind of woke up and started doing nasty things. Over the years, there's been a couple of others. More often than not, really, it's the SDK stuff is mistakes, like low quality developers building SDKs and publishing them. Mm-hmm. That don't have security DNA in their development shop. And a lot of these SDK producers do not have a security team.
Yeah.
Right. I mean, have you ever heard of a security architect working at an SDK manufacturer? So
that's a good point.
So that's why the interesting thing about what we do is because we test the binary, we test the SDK at runtime. Mm-hmm. So we can isolate that while it was running, code was going through this piece of SDK code. It was being transmitted over here in clear text to this insecure endpoint, something, 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 where if you did a source code scan, you might find some behaviors, but you're not going to find what I just described.
Yeah.
Which is
and that's
that dynamic testing side.
Yeah. And I mean, that goes to the point, like most of the time that I get source code for, if I'm doing, like we're doing a manual source code review of mobile apps, they explicitly exclude the SDKs, right? That has happened to me multiple times over the last couple of years because they're like, oh, well, this is what we control, so everything else is fine. You just look at this code specifically, and then the vulnerabilities pop up.
It's a first-party code focus, right? So I'm going to tell you that their behavior is going to change, and so for those of you in the mobile world, make sure you're paying attention to what Apple and Google are up to. So the data safety section mandate from Google that went live in the last 18 months, they are now enforcing that developers must attest to the behavior of their first-party code and their third-party code. Mm. So that person asking you for a pen test should be asking for the third-party code now.
Yeah.
Interesting. Apple's doing the same thing. So Apple's got their nutrition label that's kind of their privacy play. Well, they announced a Worldwide Developer Conference this summer, for iOS, coming to be mandatory in the spring of next year. And when Apple says it's coming, it's usually coming.
It's coming, yeah.
The developer must attest to the privacy, which has some security implications, of first-party and third-party code. And they have to submit binary readable data about the first-party and third-party code and use of private data and selective APIs as something called a privacy manifest this coming spring. So Apple and Google have figured out SDKs are part of the problem. And so they're putting the onus not on the SDK developers, but on the first-party developers who are using the third-party SDK, and they're holding them liable. So imagine a point where I submit an app to iOS or Android Play Store and you get blocked. And it's because their automated testing has discovered that a third-party SDK is doing something wrong.
Yeah.
That's coming. And we've heard something already.
This kind of sounds like, to my naive ears, like an SBOM. This manifest, this privacy manifest, it sounds similar.
The privacy manifest has some SBOM flavor to it, which is what are the third-party SDKs you're using. Yes, but you also have to talk about what private data you're storing, transmitting, and using, and that's where you need a developer to explain what that private data is. Right. So yes, an SBOM is if you literally look at the privacy manifest construct, you'll see a chunk that looks like an SBOM. What's all the third-party code in my app? Right. Mm-hmm. But then there's a whole nother section, which is what data am I using, transmitting, and storing, and to whom and where am I using, transmitting, and storing it? Right. So think of it as, where is your data going? What data is used in this app and where is it going? And they've got categories of private data, the things you would know for PII, right? Username, password, email address, location. Are you tracking geolocation of the device? Some of those kinds of things, because these devices are like a giant data aggregator.
Oh, yeah, they are,
But
right?
you also have to talk about, how you're using, are you collecting data from like the address book, or are you talking to the SMS channel, things of that nature as well. And what they're all trying to do is it's about, what's interesting is the tail wagging the dog is privacy. It's all about, Apple started it. It's all about driving privacy through the Apple ecosystem and through the Google ecosystem, which is becoming a stronger hammer in those ecosystems than what we traditionally know as security.
Mm-hmm.
Right. So I'm more worried about how my data is used, stored, and transmit than I am whether something's vulnerable, maybe not. As a business owner, if Apple's going to block me from submitting an app because it doesn't pass privacy, but they don't care about the security, then I'm going to do the privacy stuff.
Yeah.
Right?
Well,
because
we've oh, go ahead.
Oh, no, go ahead.
Yeah, go ahead. I've lost my thoughts.
I was gonna ask on the security side, is that because like the devices themselves have enough compensating controls, and then the privacy just being sort of the thing that's more, meaning there's maybe some ways to exploit that app. It would be fairly difficult, but the privacy bit, that's always on the table as a concern.
I think it's a combo of things. I'll use crypto as an example. Having weak crypto is not a privacy issue. Leaking my personal data is a privacy issue, right? So things that we in the security community would call a vulnerability aren't necessarily the same as what an individual or a company would be concerned about from a privacy perspective. A highly secure application could still be storing my PII on a server in China and violating my privacy, right? So you have this interesting like Venn diagram of the two. The reason I articulate as tail wagging the dog is between things like GDPR and CCPA that are serious penalties for privacy violations, and some of the controls Apple and Google are putting in and around the App Store where they're trying to respect user privacy as well. We're getting this grooming of kind of privacy becomes the stronger driver, because I can be blocked from the App Store, which blocks me from revenue generation, or I can be fined out of existence with GDPR, right? You kind of have that sort of natural thing where the two go together. And so helping organizations understand both of them is part of kind of our mission now as we expand in security and privacy, because mobile is leading the charge on many of the privacy initiatives we're not necessarily seeing in a lot of other places. And that's in part because Apple and Google own the big mobile ecosystems, and it's important to them. So it's driving importance to the rest of us.
Yeah. And I wonder how much of that is coming from the compliance side of the house, right? Like, so GDPR, like they've been punished in the past. Google and Apple both have been fined for leaking privacy data, for leaking, for allowing or having weak controls around that. And then I think also from a marketing perspective, it's really hard to market security, right? Like we've seen that to the general consumer. Whereas, hey, if I can market privacy, like I am protecting your data that's on your device as you're interacting with it on a daily basis, that's a lot easier tale to tell to consumers than it is like, from
think about your parents. Unless they're in the industry, security's mystifying to them, right? Security's like, Harry Potter and Hogwarts or something. But I had an ad pop up in the background on a browser. That's where that came from. Sorry. But privacy is like, oh yeah, what are they doing with my data? Oh, I'm terrified they're tracking me, right? So, but that's okay. The way I kind of look at it, because we're all trying to raise the bar to protect people and data. And if privacy mandates coming from the app stores or from governments going to help protect data, that's ultimately the reason for a security program, is to protect data, right? In the end, there's different tactics and different things you might be concerned about in one area versus the other. But protecting data is really what we're all trying to do. In mobile, you also have to protect the IP. If I go back to that resiliency issue, if people can get to your source code, right? So protecting those things is what matters. And whether the CEO is going to fund the CISO to build a security and privacy program because of privacy mandates, that's awesome.
Yeah.
Right. And if I'm a smart CISO, I'm going to take that money and make sure I'm getting both privacy and security at the same time. Right. As an example.
So, I mean, like that's the context I'm curious about. Are we talking about individual consumers, or are we talking about more of consumers in a business sense? And the reason I say this is that I get conflicting messages. Sometimes it does seem like people care about privacy. Sometimes you read articles or you see like YouTube videos where people, they don't seem to care at all about privacy. And I read specifically that the age group of like young 20-year-olds are actually believe that they've already been breached, and so it's sort of irrelevant to even
Relevant.
concern
Yeah.
yourself with privacy. So yeah, I guess that's my question is
It's a good question.
What I don't even know how to phrase this question. Is it why the mix? Yes. Why the mixed messages out there?
I think, I've got technical skills. I've got business skills. I've started companies, right? So I'm going to bring left brain and right brain together on this. It is all economics. In the end, it's all economics, right? So think about the brands in your mind that you think are like the safest, most consumer-friendly brands you can think of, right? And they're probably things like, I don't know, Coca-Cola or, something like that, where they have kind of fun ads, or like Disney with kids in movies and theme parks, right? And you just kind of work your way through. Generally, consumer brands have this, Apple themselves, right, have this really kind of strong affinity for their customers. Their customers trust them and love them. What's the worst thing that could happen to any of those companies I just listed? A giant privacy data breach.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Right.
Loss of trust.
Exactly. So look what happened to Facebook when all the crap came out around what Facebook was doing. Yes, there are people still using it. Yeah. I think most people don't trust Facebook. They use it because they use it, or they don't. Like, I don't use Facebook. My wife does, and her friends do. But that whole notion of, I think a big chunk of the Facebook is a safe place to be broke with a lot of things that happened around Facebook, right? So I think that if you have a business that's based on trust with your customer, you're going to over-rotate into privacy for logical reasons related to protecting your customer base. And it's going to be a business economic reason for doing it. Now, those companies I listed, I'm sure they're somewhere wandering around saying, make sure we comply with GDPR, but it's the business itself that's determining their customer privacy is paramount. They're a trustworthy brand. There'll be other organizations that'll be like, yeah, we don't really care about privacy, but we don't want a GDPR fine. Therefore, I'm going to go do something, right? Again, that's economics, but it's not, your brand is based on privacy and trust. It's their brand is whatever their brand is. And they just want to make sure they stay out of jail, as it were. What's interesting
that's a good point. You could end up basically testifying in front of Congress if you're Apple and get it really wrong.
Well, maybe. I mean, the way I think about it with Apple and Google is they're basically saying we're a natural choke point to help people protect their privacy. And they're viewing it not from the manufacturer or vendor side, they're viewing it from the consumer side. They're saying, Apple's saying privacy and trust is part of our Apple brand. The App Store is something we represent. We don't own the IP for the 3 million apps that run on the devices, but we want to make sure the ecosystem around those 3 million apps respect users' privacy, right? Because their company brand is privacy, right? And so if I want to play in their App Store, I have to play by their rules. Now, I might be making really good money off of playing in their App Store, so I'm going to do it.
Yeah.
Right? So, so it's interesting because I do think the privacy thing is heavily economics and emotionally tied it's economics for the business and emotion for the consumer. If you're B2C, you're going to pay attention to it. If you're B2B, it depends.
Yeah.
Like any other things, right? There's companies make business decisions all the time of what they prioritize, right?
Mm-hmm. That actually makes what you first said makes a lot of sense. Like if you're a big company and you've been established and around for a long time, and a lot of people are using your products, and they just like emotionally feel like this is just a comforting, safe, like I've been using this product, this company, this ecosystem for whatever a long time, then along comes some sort of diminished view of how they treat your personal data, or maybe it just looks like they don't care. Yeah, that's going to change your perception and maybe move you over to Android, or vice versa, or whatever it might be.
Or vice versa, or just say, I'm not going to work with that vendor anymore. Maybe I drink Pepsi instead of Coke. I'm just making something up, right? So use a different airline, what have you. There is material brand damage, right? The first largest fine in Europe for GDPR was British Airways, who had a mobile breach. Mm-hmm. They were fined 156 million pounds. They eventually negotiated down, but that was one of so the EU made an example of British Airways for shoddy work related to their mobile apps, right? So mobile is the attack vector. That shows you that the attackers are looking at mobile apps for big Fortune 100 companies, and that was the attack vector kind of and that led to the breach, right? So you don't you don't always hear about giant mobile breaches, or you hear about a breach. Like a lot of people know BA got breached. People may not know that it was a mobile breach.
Yeah.
The largest breach of records known that we know of is Under Armour MyFitnessPal.
Mm-hmm.
MyFitnessPal was over 100 million records were breached via the mobile app into their server, got root access, right?
Yeah.
That's the highest breach. Now, what was the ramifications of that? Well, they didn't get fined by anybody, but the CISO and the CIO didn't last very long.
Yeah.
Right. Their share price dropped about 20%, I think, in the first 90 days. Again, Under Armour had a trust brand. Right.
Yeah.
So they eventually recovered, brought in a security team, more formalized their procedures. They have a trust and safety board. Like they did the whole really smart boomerang, to really make it part of their DNA going forward. So it does happen, right? And that's why organizations need to pay attention to mobile as much as they do web, network, API, the other things.
Yeah.
And actually, that's another question I have. I mean, I feel like it's so established for, when I say I'd say like security in the SDLC for web apps, right? Just because that's been, one of the main things I think that we've sort of focused on as a community. I mean, it's open web application security, right? So, but how does that look from both of your experiences? How does that look, inside of organizations? Because those teams, I'll just say from my experience, pre 2014, 2015, those teams tended to be more isolated. And I don't know if that's changed. But at the time that I was working with them, they were more isolated off on their own, fringe teams doing that weird mobile stuff.
Yeah, I think
possibly different now.
It's a really good question. So I'll chunk the market into a few segments. So you have the mobile first companies like an Uber, right? So security is either part of their business or they're not. Like we ignore games because most of the game companies don't care about security. So if you're mobile first, then you probably have a security program if you're in any kind of business that transacts, for example, with customer data. If you're in a legacy business, big bank, been around for 50 years, that kind of thing. Generally, your mobile team was the Wild West on their own, still largely isolated, although mobile and web usually have common backends. So API sec is handled at corporate and API backend logic stuff is generally handled at corporate. And usually in those larger enterprises, the web application security program the mobile application security program lags the web, meaning they have a very mature web program and mobile always trails it, sometimes by years, right?
Oh, interesting.
So like I was just involved with a customer yesterday, and their literally comment on the phone was, we're finally going through the process of maturing our mobile program to match what we've had for 3 years with web. It's been a 3-year journey, right? They're really big.
I believe that.
They are, right? So that happens, right? So just like the mobile developer is kind of a specialist group that's not quite core, not necessarily operating exactly the same way the mature web team is, often the mobile security is also this kind of hanging off the slide, slightly different, slightly unique. Maybe there aren't any in-house skills and they're outsourcing a bunch of pen testing or using consultants, things like that. So there's typically a lag. There are companies where they are in parallel, and have been in parallel for a long time. Oftentimes, what they'll do is they'll say, okay, well, we already have this AST program. We're using a Checkmarx, a Veracode, one of those. Yep. We are doing pen testing with company XYZ. Let's see what they have for mobile. And They might have a SAS scanner. They might have 1 or 2 pen testers hiding in the corner that does mobile or what have you. And they'll do some basic hygiene work, right? And as I said before, the top SCA vendors don't really cover mobile. So if you're relying on a top SCA, don't assume you're getting full coverage for your mobile third-party libraries. Same thing happens from a web scanner. So, they might support Swift, but not Objective-C. They might, or the other way around, or they might only support a certain version of Java, but only builds on these systems. So the traditional AST vendors have done a little bit of work, but they're not like the best of breed thing. So if mobile's first class, you should be using best of breed pen testers who really know what they're doing and use best of breed security tools for your testing and your training, right?
Yep.
So they just all live in different places. What I'll tell you about that OWASP benchmark, just to go back to it, 95% of those 6,500 most popular downloaded apps violate one or more of the controls on OWASP MASVS. So only 5% are doing it right, which to me says that most of the world has immature programs.
Yep.
Right. And they might think they've got it licked by doing once a year partial pen test on first party code. Great example you had there, Seth.
Yep.
Or they might be doing a little bit of Java based source code scanning on Android, but not have anything for iOS. And that's kind of leaving them at risk. And so part of the reason for publishing the benchmark report, besides the intellectual curiosity, was, hey, folks, like, we'd love to have you, MASVS is free. Go download it, use it in your strategy. This will tell you where the edges of the envelope are that you need to test for. And here are some areas you should focus on, because it's probably where you're most likely vulnerable. Third-party app, third-party libraries, network, storage, crypto. And if you do that, you can groom hygiene in pretty quickly and figure out what you don't know and solve some of those pretty fast and get that program under control.
Yep.
So that's what we hope.
And that's a great summary.
Yeah. Yeah, it is. It is. And I mean, that was going to be my question. And I know, Brian, we're pushing up against top of the hour. I know we've got a hard stop. So, thank you again for, coming here. But that was going to be my question, is kind of like where to start. And I think that puts a good summary on it, right? It's a process issue that we're running into. And that's what I see from a consulting perspective is that lack of real discipline across all of the different platforms, right? Web, API, right? Like they lick one, like you were saying, but the others are weak. And so it's great to have like just a light being shown on the mobile space, because it has kind of been excuse the phrase, but redheaded stepchild of the, the security space, right?
It has. There's a security architect consultant I met many years ago, and he said going into every company and looking at their security program is like a new Rorschach test. You get those crazy ink blot splotches, and nobody's got the full screen. Almost never does he have somebody with the full picture. And it has to do with the history of how companies grow, right? There's legacy code everywhere, right?
Yeah.
There's tech debt you're dealing with. There's the business screaming, I need this new app or this new feature, or we want to go into this new market, right? And that's just part of the challenge we all have in building and delivering software in a safe and secure, as all those different things factor in.
Amen.
The biggest thing is, man, mobile is a weak point, most likely for your org, and you may or may not know it. And you ought to try to take a look at it to make sure you got enough there that your enterprise is safe, but also, your enterprise delivery is safe and your customers are safe. That's kind of the big thing that I spend a lot of my days talking about.
Cool. Yeah. Well, great. We appreciate you coming on, Brian. It's been a fascinating, hour.
Very much so.
I'm sure we could go for at least another hour or two. This seems to be a running theme with the guests that we have on. And so as it matures, we'll keep an eye on it. And if you're interested in, a follow-up, we'll definitely follow up with you on it. Any last minute, advice or places that people can find you to ask additional questions?
Sure. So you're welcome to find me on LinkedIn. I am Brian C. Reed, because there's many Brian Reeds in the world. Okay. You can also find me at Reed on the Run on Twitter/X or whatever your favorite social media channel is. Thanks everybody for the time here. Take a look at the OWASP benchmark. If you're not familiar with the OWASP MASVS program, please get involved. There's a lot of free assets out there to get you going. So we encourage everyone. And by the way, if you're a pen tester, people pay a premium for mobile pen testing. Build the skill set, man. It's a good place to grow your career.
It is. Yep. Take a look at it. Join us on Slack. If you have additional questions, we can point you at all these resources as well. But Brian, thanks again. And Ken, any last minute thoughts before we close it out today?
Oh, just thanks to Brian and thanks to the viewers. Appreciate it.
Thanks for joining us today. All right. Thanks, everybody. We'll see you soon.